On November 3rd, 1854, the mayor of Vicksburg, Mississippi, walked into his office and found a single piece of paper on his desk. The paper contained 3 lines, written in elegant cursive. The handwriting was familiar, though he couldn't place it. The words made his blood run cold. Mr. Harrison, the gambling debt, Tuesday night, the warehouse, the girl from Natchez. The mayor's hands trembled as he read the note again. No signature, no demands, just 3 facts that only 2 people in the world should have known. And one of those people had died 6 months earlier in a riding accident. He burned the note in his fireplace that morning, but 2 days later the city council voted exactly as the note had suggested they should. A zoning change that made no sense to anyone except the mayor, who understood that he had no choice. Someone knew. Someone was watching. Someone had power over him that should have been impossible. This wasn't the first such note, and it wouldn't be the last. Before we continue with the story of how an enslaved man named Solomon controlled an entire Mississippi River town without anyone realizing it until years after his death, make sure you're subscribed to this channel and hit that notification bell. Because what happened in Vicksburg between 1847 and 1854 challenges everything we think we know about power, control, and the antebellum South. And leave a comment telling me what state or city you're listening from. We want to know where our community is watching from. Now, let me tell you about the most carefully hidden secret in Mississippi history. Vicksburg in 1847 was a city drunk on its own prosperity. Perched on the bluffs overlooking the Mississippi River, it served as one of the most important ports between New Orleans and St. Louis. Cotton moved through Vicksburg by the ton. Riverboats docked at its wharves day and night, loading and unloading cargo, passengers, mail, money. The city had been incorporated only 18 years earlier, but it had grown with shocking speed. By 1847, its population had reached nearly 4,000 people. The city proper stretched along the bluffs, a maze of streets that climbed up from the river landing. Merchants built their businesses along Washington Street and Cherry Street. The wealthy built their homes on the higher ground, where the air was cleaner and the summer heat slightly less oppressive. The city's economy depended entirely on cotton and the labor of enslaved people. The surrounding plantations produced thousands of bales annually. Those bales came to Vicksburg to be weighed, compressed, stored, and shipped. The commission merchants who handled these transactions were among the wealthiest men in Mississippi. They advanced money to planters against future crops. They arranged shipping. They took their percentage. And they lived like kings. Behind this prosperity stood a carefully maintained social order. White men controlled everything through a network of formal and informal power structures. The city council, the commercial exchanges, the banks, the courts, all operated according to rules designed to keep power concentrated in the hands of a small group of families. The Balfours, the Kleins, the McRavens, the Speaks. These names appeared on every important document, every deed, every business charter. And supporting this entire structure, invisible and essential, were nearly 2,000 enslaved people. They worked as domestic servants, as dock workers, as craftsmen, as laborers. They built the buildings, cooked the food, cleaned the houses, raised the children, did the back-breaking work that made the city function. They were everywhere and nowhere, present but not acknowledged, essential but not valued. The law defined them as property. City ordinances controlled their movement. They needed written passes to travel after dark. They were forbidden to gather in groups. They were prohibited from learning to read or write. The entire legal structure existed to keep them powerless, to prevent any possibility of organized resistance or collective action. But power is a strange thing. It doesn't always flow through the channels we create for it. Sometimes it finds other routes, hidden pathways that exist beneath the surface of formal structures. And in Vicksburg, Mississippi, in the years between 1847 and 1854, Power flowed through the hands of a man who legally had none. His name was Solomon. The first recorded mention of Solomon appears in a property transfer document dated April 12, 1847. A merchant named Richard Caldwell purchased him from a plantation in Natchez for the substantial sum of $1,400. The bill of sale describes Solomon as approximately 35 years old, of medium height and build, with no distinguishing marks or characteristics. The seller noted that Solomon had been trained as a house servant and possessed skills in bookkeeping and correspondence. This last detail was unusual. Enslaved people were prohibited by law from being taught to read and write. The fact that Solomon possessed these skills suggested either that he had been taught before such education became illegal, or that he had learned in secret despite the prohibition. The bill of sale offered no explanation. Richard Caldwell was a cotton factor, a middleman who handled transactions between plantation owners and buyers. His business required meticulous record-keeping. He needed to track hundreds of transactions simultaneously, maintain accurate accounts, correspond with clients across multiple states. This kind of work required someone with education, with numerical facility, with the ability to manage complex information. Caldwell was 52 years old in 1847, a widower with no children. He'd built his business over 20 years through careful attention to detail and absolute discretion. Planters trusted him because he kept their affairs private. Buyers trusted him because his records were accurate. His reputation was his most valuable asset. When Caldwell purchased Solomon, he was looking for someone to help manage his increasingly complex business. The expense was justified, he wrote in a letter to his brother, because a trained servant capable of managing accounts will save me hours of labor daily and allow me to expand my operations considerably. Solomon arrived in Vicksburg on a steamboat from Natchez on a Thursday afternoon. Caldwell met him at the landing personally, a courtesy he rarely extended. Several people who were present that day would later remember the moment, though at the time it seemed unremarkable. Solomon walked down the gangplank carrying a small trunk. He was dressed neatly but simply in dark trousers and a white shirt. His posture was upright but not proud. His expression was neutral, carefully blank. He looked directly at Caldwell and nodded once, a gesture that acknowledged his new owner without suggesting any emotion about the transaction. "You'll work in my office," Caldwell said. "You'll manage my correspondence and accounts. You'll maintain confidentiality about all business matters. Do you understand?" "Yes, sir," Solomon replied. His voice was quiet, cultured. His English was perfect, without the dialect that characterized most enslaved people's speech in Mississippi. This immediately marked him as unusual. Caldwell led him to a small house on Mulberry Street, where the office occupied the first floor and living quarters were on the second. Solomon was given a room at the back of the first floor, adjacent to the office itself. The room was small but adequate, furnished with a bed, a chair, a small table, a wash basin. A window overlooked an alley. "You'll begin tomorrow morning," Caldwell said. "I'll show you the account books and explain my system. Your work will be entirely confidential. You'll speak to no one about what you see or hear in this office. Is that clear?" "Yes, sir." Solomon's first weeks in Vicksburg passed quietly. He worked in Caldwell's office from early morning until late evening, learning the business, studying the account books, familiarizing himself with Caldwell's clients and their various arrangements. The work was demanding but not physically difficult. It required concentration, accuracy, discretion. Caldwell's business involved handling cotton from more than 40 plantations. Each planter had different arrangements, different credit terms, different shipping preferences. Solomon's job was to track all of this, to maintain records of who owed what to whom, to prepare correspondence, to ensure that transactions were executed properly. Within a month, Caldwell began to rely on Solomon completely. The enslaved man's facility with numbers was extraordinary. He could calculate interest and commissions in his head. He could spot discrepancies in accounts immediately. He never forgot a detail, never misplaced a document, never made an error in transcription. More importantly, Solomon understood the unspoken aspects of the business. He recognized which clients were struggling financially, which were prospering, which were hiding their difficulties behind bluster and optimism. He saw patterns in the data that Caldwell himself had missed. "You have a gift for this work," Caldwell told him one evening in June. They were working late, preparing documents for a complex transaction. "I've employed clerks before, white men with education, and none possessed your facility." Solomon said nothing. He simply continued his work. But Caldwell's observation was accurate. Solomon did have a gift, though it wasn't the gift Caldwell thought. Solomon's true skill wasn't in managing numbers, it was in managing information. And over the months that followed, Solomon began to accumulate information that would change everything. The nature of Caldwell's business meant that Solomon saw everything, every transaction, every debt, every agreement. He read correspondence from planters, confessing financial difficulties to their factor. He reviewed bills of sale that revealed which families were selling property to cover debts. He processed contracts that showed who was borrowing, from whom, at what rates. This information was supposed to remain confidential. Caldwell's reputation depended on discretion. But Solomon was seeing it all, day after day, transaction after transaction. And unlike the white clerks who had worked for Caldwell previously, Solomon had no social connections in Vicksburg, no friends or family he might gossip with, no life outside the office. Or so everyone assumed. The truth was different. Solomon did have connections in Vicksburg. He had built them carefully, quietly, in ways that left no obvious trace. He had done this by exploiting something that white residents of Vicksburg never acknowledged, the invisible network of communication that existed among enslaved people. Enslaved people in Vicksburg moved through the city constantly. They ran errands for their owners, carried messages, made deliveries, performed tasks that required them to be visible but not noticed. And as they moved, they talked. They shared information, they built relationships, they created a system of communication that operated entirely beneath the awareness of white residents. Solomon understood this system, and he had begun to use it. Every Sunday, enslaved people in Vicksburg were permitted to attend church services. Most went to the First African Baptist Church, a wooden structure on Monroe Street. The church had been established by white Baptist leaders who saw religious instruction as a means of social control, a way to encourage obedience and acceptance among enslaved people. But the church also served another function. It was one of the few places where enslaved people could gather legally, where they could see and speak to people from different households, where information could be exchanged. Solomon attended services every Sunday. He sat in the back, listened quietly, sang the hymns. To any observer, he appeared to be exactly what he was supposed to be, a well-behaved slave seeking spiritual comfort. But during those services, before and after the formal proceedings, Solomon talked to people. Quietly, carefully, he built relationships. He talked to a woman named Rachel, who worked as a cook in the household of Judge Edmund Burke. He talked to a man named Isaiah, who served as butler for merchant James Klein. He talked to a woman named Dinah, who managed the household of banker Theodore Balfour. He talked to dozens of others, all of them working in positions that gave them access to the private lives of Vicksburg's most powerful families. And he listened. What Solomon learned from these conversations was extraordinary. He learned which families were struggling despite their public displays of wealth. He learned about gambling debts, about infidelities, about business deals that skirted legal boundaries. He learned about the hidden connections between respectable citizens and criminal enterprises, about the private scandals that threatened public reputations. This information had enormous potential value. But Solomon understood something crucial. Information alone isn't power. Power comes from how you use information. And to use information effectively, you need leverage. You need the ability to act without being detected. You need a system. Solomon began to build that system in the fall of 1847. The first step was establishing communication channels. Solomon needed ways to pass messages to specific people without being seen or identified. This was dangerous. If he was caught, the consequences would be severe. But Solomon was methodical, patient, willing to move slowly. He began by identifying enslaved people who had regular, predictable movement through the city, people who made deliveries, who ran errands, who had legitimate reasons to be in multiple locations. He recruited them carefully, never revealing his full purpose, always presenting his requests as simple favors. Could you deliver this package to the Klein household? Just leave it on the back porch, no need to mention where it came from. Would you mind dropping this note at the mayor's office? Put it under the door, it's nothing important. Each person he recruited only handled one small task. No one except Solomon saw the full system. No one except Solomon understood how these individual actions connected into a larger structure. The second step was establishing credibility. Solomon needed to demonstrate that he had real information, that his knowledge was accurate, that he could be believed. This was critical because the entire system would collapse if his information proved false. He began with something small. In December 1847, the city council was scheduled to vote on a proposal to expand the city cemetery. The proposal had support from several prominent citizens who owned land adjacent to the current cemetery and would profit from the expansion. The vote seemed certain to pass. But Solomon had learned something through his network. He had learned that Judge Burke, one of the council members supporting the expansion, had a secret financial interest in a competing proposal. Burke had invested in land on the opposite side of town and would profit more if the expansion happened there instead. Solomon also knew that Burke was having an affair with the wife of a merchant named Thomas Harrison. This information came from Rachel, Burke's cook, who saw and heard everything that happened in his household. Solomon sent Judge Burke a note. The note was delivered by a teenage boy who worked as a runner for various businesses in town. The boy didn't know who had given him the note, didn't know what it contained, didn't know why he'd been paid a penny to slip it under Burke's door. The note was brief. Your investment in the Western Tract is known. Your arrangement with Mrs. Harrison is known. Vote against the cemetery expansion, or both facts become public knowledge. Burke received the note on a Tuesday evening. He read it in his study, alone, and felt his world shift. The note revealed information that only 3 people should have known: Burke himself, his business partner in the land investment, and Thomas Harrison. The fact that someone else knew suggested either betrayal or surveillance, neither of which Burke could comprehend. More disturbing was the note's tone. It wasn't threatening, exactly. It was simply factual. Someone knew. Someone was watching. Someone had power over him. When the city council voted 3 days later, Burke voted against the cemetery expansion. He offered no explanation for his change of position. The expansion failed by a single vote. Solomon had proven his system worked. Over the next 6 months, Solomon sent similar notes to 4 other prominent citizens. Each note revealed information that should have been private. Each note included a suggestion about a specific action the recipient should take. Each recipient complied. A bank president voted to approve a loan that benefited a business owned by an enslaved person's relatives. A merchant agreed to hire a free black craftsman despite community pressure not to. A judge dismissed charges against an enslaved man accused of theft. A plantation owner agreed to purchase a specific enslaved family, keeping them together rather than selling them separately. None of these actions was dramatic. None drew significant attention. But collectively, they represented something unprecedented, an enslaved person exercising real power over white citizens, shaping decisions that affected the community operating a system of control that existed entirely in shadow. And no one suspected, because how could they? The idea that a slave could possess such knowledge, could organize such a system, could exercise such influence, was literally unthinkable within the social and mental framework of 1842, Mississippi. By the spring of 1848, Solomon's system had expanded considerably. He was now maintaining mental records of information on more than 30 prominent citizens of Vicksburg. He knew their financial situations, their family secrets, their hidden connections, their vulnerabilities. And he was using this knowledge systematically to influence decisions that affected both the enslaved community and certain free citizens he chose to protect. Richard Caldwell noticed none of this. To him, Solomon remained exactly what he appeared to be, an excellent clerk, efficient and trustworthy, whose work allowed Caldwell to expand his business significantly. Caldwell's income had increased 40% since hiring Solomon. He attributed this success to Solomon's organizational skills and his own business acumen. The reality was more complex. Solomon had been carefully steering certain transactions in directions that benefited Caldwell, while simultaneously serving Solomon's larger purposes. He'd encouraged Caldwell to take on clients who had specific vulnerabilities, who owed debts to people Solomon wanted leverage over, who occupied positions where they could be useful. Caldwell thought he was making smart business decisions. He didn't realize he was following a script written by the man he owned. The breakthrough in Solomon's operation came in June 1848, when a crisis emerged that threatened to expose everything. A young enslaved woman named Sarah, 19 years old, worked as a domestic servant in the household of merchant James Klein. Sarah had been born on Klein's plantation outside Vicksburg and brought to the city when she was 16. She was quiet, efficient, and by all accounts gave her owner no trouble. But Sarah had a secret. She had taught herself to read by studying her owner's newspapers when no one was watching. This was extraordinarily dangerous. The Mississippi Slave Code of 1830 made it illegal to teach enslaved people to read or write, with penalties for both teacher and student. But Sarah had been careful, and she'd succeeded. One evening in early June, Klein's wife discovered Sarah reading a book in the kitchen. The book had been left on a table by Klein's teenage son, and Sarah had picked it up without thinking, too absorbed in the story to hear Mrs. Klein approaching. Mrs. Klein's reaction was immediate and predictable. She called for her husband, who came downstairs and saw Sarah still holding the book. Klein was furious. Not just because Sarah could read, which was illegal, but because her ability to read meant she'd been deceiving him, had been exposed to ideas and information that might make her dangerous. "How long has this been going on?" Klein demanded. Sarah said nothing. "How did you learn? Who taught you?" Still silence. Klein struck her across the face, hard enough to knock her to the floor. "Answer me." Sarah looked up at him, blood trickling from her split lip, and made a decision that would change everything. "I taught myself," she said quietly, "and I know what you wrote in the letter to Mr. Balfour, about the cotton shipment, about the money that went missing." Klein went very still. The letter Sarah referenced had been written 2 weeks earlier. It contained information about a business arrangement that Klein and banker Theodore Balfour had made, an arrangement that involved falsifying records to hide certain financial transactions. If that information became public, both men would face serious consequences. "What did you say?" Klein's voice was barely above a whisper. "I read the letter before you sent it," Sarah said. Her voice was steady despite her fear. "I know what it said. I know what you did." This was Solomon's doing, though Klein didn't know it. Solomon had learned about the letter from Isaiah, who worked as Balfour's butler, and had seen correspondence discussing the arrangement. Solomon had then passed information to Sarah through their mutual connection at church, telling her exactly what to say if she was ever discovered reading. It was a calculated risk. Sarah would face punishment for reading, but she might avoid the worst consequences if Klein feared exposure more than he valued discipline. Klein stood frozen, his mind racing. If Sarah had read the letter, she had information that could destroy him, but she was his property. He could beat her, sell her, even kill her with minimal legal consequence. The only risk was that she might have told someone else what she knew. "Who else knows about this letter?" he asked. "No one," Sarah lied. "But if something happens to me, the information will reach Judge Burke by morning." This was pure bluff. Sarah had no way to ensure such a message reached anyone, but Klein didn't know that. And the mention of Judge Burke, a man known for his rigid interpretation of commercial law, made the threat credible. Klein made his decision. "Go to your quarters, stay there. Don't speak to anyone about this. We'll discuss your situation tomorrow." Sarah obeyed. She went to the small room she occupied in the back of the Klein house, and she waited. She didn't know if Klein would honor his implied promise, or if he would simply have her beaten and sold away. She only knew that she'd played the card Solomon had given her. The next morning, Klein visited Solomon's network through an indirect route. He spoke to his business partner, who spoke to a mutual acquaintance, who eventually brought the question to someone who had connections to the enslaved community. The question was simple. Was there a way to send a message to someone who might be passing information about business matters? The answer came back through the same indirect route. Leave a written message in a specific location. It will reach the appropriate person. Klein followed these instructions. He left a note in the designated spot, a hollow in a tree near the riverfront. The note read, "I need assurance that certain information will remain confidential. What can be arranged?" Solomon received the note within hours. He read it carefully, understanding immediately what had happened. Sarah had used the information he'd provided, and Klein had responded exactly as Solomon had hoped. Klein was now engaged with the system, seeking to negotiate rather than to punish. Solomon composed a response. He wrote it in his careful script, deliberately distinct from any handwriting Klein might recognize. "Miss Sarah will not be punished or sold. She will be permitted to remain in your household with her current duties. In return, the information she possesses will remain private. Future arrangements can be discussed if necessary." Klein received this response and felt a mixture of relief and frustration. Someone was negotiating on behalf of an enslaved woman, treating her as though she had rights, as though she were a person capable of making agreements. It violated every social convention Klein understood, but it also solved his immediate problem. Sarah remained in the Klein household. She continued her work, now with the added knowledge that she had successfully threatened her owner and survived. And Klein joined the growing list of prominent citizens who were, without fully realizing it, taking instructions from a man who legally had no power at all. But Solomon's system was about to face its most serious test. The problem emerged in August 1848, when a cotton broker named William Marsh arrived in Vicksburg from New Orleans. Marsh was conducting an audit of several commission merchants' accounts, looking for discrepancies that might indicate fraud or embezzlement. It was routine business, the kind of examination that happened periodically to maintain confidence in the cotton trade. Richard Caldwell's accounts were among those selected for review. This should have been unremarkable. Caldwell's records were meticulous, and he had nothing to hide. But Solomon recognized immediately that the audit posed a different kind of threat. If someone examined Caldwell's accounts closely enough, they might notice patterns that Solomon had created. Transactions that had been steered in specific directions, clients who had been selected for particular reasons, arrangements that made sense commercially but also served Solomon's purposes. The patterns were subtle. Solomon had been careful, but they existed, and a trained observer might see them. More concerning, Marsh's visit would require Solomon to provide access to all of Caldwell's records. Marsh would spend days in the office, reviewing ledgers, asking questions, examining documents. He would see everything Solomon had been seeing. He might recognize things Solomon didn't want recognized. Solomon considered his options. He could try to hide certain records, but that would raise suspicions. He could alter documents, but that was risky and might be detected. Or he could do something more dramatic. He chose the latter. Solomon had learned something about William Marsh through his network. Marsh was married, had 3 children, and lived in a comfortable home in New Orleans. He was also deeply in debt due to gambling losses. These debts were known to his creditors but hidden from his employers and from his wife. If the debts became public, Marsh would lose his position and possibly his family. Solomon arranged for Marsh to receive a visitor on his second day in Vicksburg. The visitor was a free black man named Benjamin, who worked as a porter and ran errands for various businesses. Benjamin approached Marsh at his hotel and handed him a sealed envelope. "What's this?" Marsh asked, confused. "A gentleman asked me to deliver it, sir," Benjamin replied. "No name given." Marsh opened the envelope and found a single sheet of paper. The paper contained a detailed accounting of his gambling debts, including amounts, creditors, and dates. At the bottom was a brief message. "Your audit of Caldwell's accounts will find nothing irregular. Your report will indicate that all records are accurate and properly maintained. If you follow these instructions, your debts remain private." Marsh felt the blood drain from his face. Someone knew. Someone who had no business knowing. Someone who was watching him, tracking his financial situation, who had power over his future. The audit proceeded. Marsh spent 3 days examining Caldwell's records. He reviewed every transaction, checked calculations, verified documents. And he found nothing irregular because he was looking for nothing. He saw what Solomon wanted him to see, a well-run business with meticulous records. Marsh's report stated that Caldwell's accounts were exemplary, among the best maintained he'd examined. Caldwell received this news with satisfaction. His business reputation was confirmed. His clerk's work was vindicated. Solomon had successfully protected his operation while expanding his influence. Marsh returned to New Orleans, carrying the knowledge that someone in Vicksburg possessed information about him, someone who could destroy him with a single revelation. He would be useful in the future if Solomon needed someone in New Orleans. But Solomon's success had created a new problem. The system was growing too large. Too many people were receiving notes, following instructions, making decisions based on information that shouldn't exist. Sooner or later, someone would notice the pattern. Someone would start asking questions. That someone was a lawyer named Robert Sinclair. Sinclair was 38 years old, Harvard-educated, and relatively new to Vicksburg. He'd arrived from Virginia 3 years earlier, seeking opportunities in Mississippi's booming economy. He'd established a successful practice handling contracts, property disputes, and estate matters for the city's merchant class. Sinclair was intelligent, observant, and skeptical. He didn't accept things at face value. When he noticed something unusual, he investigated. In September 1848, Sinclair noticed something very unusual. 3 of his clients had recently made decisions that contradicted their stated interests and known inclinations. Judge Burke had voted against a profitable land deal. James Klein had suddenly become cooperative about a contract dispute he'd been fighting aggressively. Theodore Balfour had approved a loan that appeared to violate the bank's standard lending criteria. Individually, these decisions might have been explained by changing circumstances or personal whims, but together they suggested a pattern, and Sinclair had been trained to recognize patterns. He began making inquiries, careful, informal questions posed to clients over dinner or in casual conversation. He asked Burke why he'd changed his position on the cemetery expansion. Burke deflected, offering vague explanations about reconsidering the public interest. Sinclair asked Klein about the contract dispute. Klein became defensive, insisting his decision had been purely commercial. Sinclair recognized the signs of people hiding something. He continued investigating, expanding his inquiries, speaking to more people. And gradually, a picture emerged. Multiple prominent citizens had recently made decisions that seemed out of character, all within the past year, all without clear explanation. This suggested coordination, but coordination implied organization, and organization implied leadership. Someone was influencing these decisions. Someone had leverage over multiple prominent citizens simultaneously. But who and how? Sinclair approached the problem methodically. He created a list of everyone who had made unusual decisions. He noted the approximate timing. He looked for connections between the individuals. What he found was disturbing. The people on his list had nothing obvious in common. Different businesses, different social circles, different interests. The only connection was that they'd all done something unexpected in the past 18 months. Unless there was another connection Sinclair wasn't seeing. He broadened his investigation. He examined public records, looking for patterns in city council votes, business transactions, legal proceedings. He found more anomalies. Small decisions that seemed inconsistent with the decision-makers' known positions, cases that were dismissed unexpectedly, contracts that were approved despite obvious problems. The pattern was unmistakable once Sinclair knew to look for it. Someone was exercising influence over Vicksburg's power structure. Someone had information they were using to control decisions. Someone was operating a sophisticated system of manipulation that had been invisible until now. Sinclair drafted a letter to Judge Burke requesting a private meeting. He didn't explain his purpose, but his tone made clear that the matter was serious. Burke agreed to meet. They met in Burke's study on a Thursday evening in October 1848. Burke was visibly uncomfortable, which confirmed Sinclair's suspicions that the judge had something to hide. "I'll be direct," Sinclair said. "You and several other prominent citizens have made decisions in recent months that appear inconsistent with your known interests. I've been investigating, and I believe these decisions are connected. I believe someone is influencing you." Burke's face went pale. "That's an extraordinary accusation." "It's not an accusation. It's an observation. I'm trying to understand what's happening." Burke was silent for a long moment. Finally, he spoke. "What do you think is happening?" "I think someone has information about you. Information you want kept private. I think they've used this information to persuade you to make specific decisions. And I think the same thing has happened to others." Burke's silence confirmed everything. "Who is it?" Sinclair pressed. "Who has this kind of access? Who could gather information about so many different people?" "I don't know," Burke admitted. "I've never met them. I received a note. I followed its suggestion. That's all." "A note from whom?" "I don't know. It was unsigned, delivered anonymously." Sinclair felt a chill. An invisible adversary, operating through anonymous notes, gathering information and dispensing instructions. It was sophisticated, careful, and deeply unsettling. "Have you received other notes?" Sinclair asked. "2 others, both in the past year." "Did you comply with their suggestions?" Burke nodded, his expression miserable. "Do you still have the notes?" "No, I burned them immediately." Sinclair interviewed 4 other men who'd been on his list. All told similar stories. Anonymous notes revealing private information, suggestions about specific actions to take, compliance out of fear that their secrets would be exposed. None of them knew who was behind the notes. None had kept the notes as evidence. None had told anyone else about the situation. They'd all responded to the threats individually, in secret, exactly as the note writer had presumably wanted. Sinclair compiled his findings, an organized system of blackmail operating in Vicksburg, multiple victims, anonymous notes, accurate information about private matters. Coordination across different sectors of the community. It was unprecedented in his experience. But Sinclair was also a pragmatist. He recognized that exposing this system would require his clients to admit their secrets publicly. The scandal would damage everyone involved. Burke's affair would become public. Klein's business impropriety would be revealed. Others would face similar exposure. No one wanted that. And without victims willing to testify, there was no case to prosecute. Sinclair made a decision. He would investigate privately, trying to identify the person behind the system, but he would not involve the authorities unless absolutely necessary. His investigation led him to several dead ends. The notes were delivered by different people, none of whom knew who had hired them. The information in the notes came from sources no one could identify. The system left no obvious traces. But Sinclair was persistent. He began examining who had access to the kind of information the notes revealed. Business dealings, family secrets, private arrangements. This information existed somewhere, recorded in documents, discussed in private conversations, known to specific individuals. Gradually, Sinclair narrowed his focus. Commission merchants had broad access to financial information. Domestic servants had access to family secrets. Lawyers saw confidential matters. Bankers knew about debts and loans. The person behind the system had to be someone with access to multiple information sources. Someone who could move between different social circles, who could observe without being noticed, who could gather and process large amounts of data. Sinclair's investigation was leading him toward the truth, but he didn't realize how dangerous this was. He didn't understand that Solomon had been monitoring his inquiries through the same network that gathered information about everyone else. Solomon knew about Robert Sinclair's investigation within days of its beginning. Isaiah, who worked as Theodore Balfour's butler, had overheard Balfour discussing Sinclair's questions with his wife. Rachel had learned that Judge Burke had met privately with Sinclair and had seemed troubled afterward. Other members of Solomon's network reported similar observations. Solomon recognized the threat immediately. Sinclair was intelligent, methodical, and determined. Given time, he might trace the system back to its source. That couldn't be allowed to happen. Solomon's first impulse was to send Sinclair a note, to warn him away from the investigation by revealing something compromising. But Solomon didn't have information about Sinclair. The lawyer was relatively new to Vicksburg, kept his personal life private, and conducted his business with impeccable propriety. This forced Solomon to try a different approach. Solomon knew that Sinclair was investigating because he'd noticed a pattern of unusual decisions. The solution was to make the pattern disappear. If people stopped receiving notes, if the unusual decisions ended, Sinclair would have nothing to investigate. The mystery would remain unsolved, but it would become old news, something people gradually forgot. Solomon ceased operations in late October 1848. No more notes were sent, no more instructions were given. The system went dormant. Sinclair noticed the change. The pattern of unusual decisions stopped abruptly, which confirmed his theory that someone had been coordinating them, but it also eliminated his ability to investigate further. Without new incidents, he had no new leads. Sinclair spent November searching for connections between past incidents, trying to identify a common thread. He examined records at the courthouse, looking for patterns in property transfers, legal filings, business registrations. He interviewed more people, asking about servants, clerks, anyone who might have access to multiple households. His investigation came tantalizingly close to the truth. At one point, he compiled a list of enslaved people who worked in households connected to the notes. Solomon's network members appeared on that list. But Sinclair dismissed them as suspects because the idea that enslaved people could organize such a system seemed impossible. Sinclair's fundamental assumption, shared by everyone in Vicksburg's white community, was that enslaved people lacked the intelligence, education, and autonomy necessary to operate a sophisticated blackmail scheme. This assumption was his blind spot, and Solomon had been counting on it. By December, Sinclair's investigation had stalled completely. He drafted a confidential memorandum summarizing his findings, but acknowledged that he'd failed to identify the perpetrator. The memorandum was filed in his private papers and not shared publicly. Solomon had won, his system remained hidden, his identity remained secret, and he could resume operations when the situation stabilized. But something unexpected happened. Richard Caldwell died. Caldwell suffered a stroke on the morning of December 14th, 1848. He'd been working in his office, reviewing accounts, when he suddenly collapsed. Solomon found him on the floor, unconscious, barely breathing. Solomon called for help, and a doctor was summoned, but there was nothing to be done. Caldwell died 3 hours later without regaining consciousness. He was 53 years old. Caldwell's death created an immediate crisis for Solomon. Under Mississippi law, an enslaved person was property that passed to heirs according to the deceased owner's will. Caldwell had no children, no close family. His will, drafted 5 years earlier, left his property to a cousin in Tennessee. This meant Solomon would be sold to settle Caldwell's estate. The estate administrator was a lawyer named Charles Morton. Morton's job was to inventory Caldwell's assets, pay any outstanding debts, and distribute remaining property to the designated heir. This process typically took several months. Solomon understood that he had perhaps 3 months before he would be sold and sent to Tennessee, 3 months to secure his future, 3 months to transform his situation from vulnerable property to something else. He made his decision. He would buy his own freedom. This was theoretically possible under Mississippi law. Enslaved people could be manumitted through legal documents if the owner agreed and certain conditions were met. But it required money, significant money, which Solomon didn't have. Or did he? Solomon had spent 18 months managing information and influencing decisions. He'd built a system that reached into dozens of households, that connected to dozens of people who owed him something, who would prefer that certain information remain private. This system had value, and Solomon was about to monetize it. He began with James Klein. Solomon sent Klein a note through the usual channel. The note explained that Solomon would soon be sold unless he could purchase his freedom. The price would be $1,400, the same amount Caldwell had paid for him. Solomon was offering Klein an opportunity to contribute $200 toward this amount. In return, all information Solomon possessed about Klein's business dealings would be permanently forgotten. Klein received the note with a mixture of relief and resentment. He was being extorted, clearly, but he was also being offered a solution. If he paid $200, his secrets would remain safe. More importantly, the mysterious system that had been manipulating him would disappear. Klein paid. Solomon sent similar notes to 6 other men: Judge Burke, Theodore Balfour, William Marsh in New Orleans, and 3 others who had received notes in the past. Each was offered the same bargain: contribute money towards Solomon's freedom, and all compromising information would be permanently destroyed. All 6 paid. Some resentfully, some with relief, but all recognized that $200 was a bargain compared to the damage that exposure would cause. Within 3 weeks, Solomon had collected $1,400. He had done it through a system he'd built without anyone's knowledge or permission, using information he'd gathered while existing in a social position that gave him access while denying him rights. Now came the difficult part. Solomon needed to convince Charles Morton, the estate administrator, to allow him to purchase his freedom using this money. But he couldn't explain where the money came from without exposing the entire system. Solomon approached Morton in early January 1849. They met in Morton's office on Washington Street. Solomon stood in front of Morton's desk, holding a cloth bag that contained $1,400 in gold and paper currency. "Mr. Morton, I would like to purchase my freedom from Mr. Caldwell's estate." Morton looked up, surprised. "That's an unusual request. I have the money, The full purchase price that Mr. Caldwell paid for me, $1,400. Morton studied Solomon carefully. Where did you acquire such a sum? This was the critical moment. Solomon had prepared his answer carefully. I have been saving tips and small payments received for services rendered over many years. I have also been fortunate enough to have friends who contributed to help me achieve freedom. It was technically true. The money had been received for services rendered, though those services were not what Morton imagined, and the contributors could be called friends, in a twisted sort of way. Morton was skeptical. That's a substantial amount. I would need verification that this money was obtained legitimately. The money is legitimate, sir. I can provide statements from several respected citizens confirming that they contributed to a fund for my manumission. This was Solomon's gambit. The men who had paid him would confirm the contributions if asked, because they had no choice. Denying the contributions would raise questions about where the money really came from, which would lead to investigations they desperately wanted to avoid. Morton considered the situation. He had no legal obligation to accept Solomon's offer, but he also had no particular reason to refuse. The estate would receive the same value whether Solomon was sold to someone else or granted freedom. And there was something appealing about an enslaved person purchasing his own freedom, a narrative of self-improvement that fit prevailing ideas about deserving individuals. I'll need to verify your claims. If the money is legitimate and can be properly documented, I see no reason to prevent the transaction. Morton contacted 3 of the men Solomon had named as contributors. Each confirmed that they had donated money to help Solomon purchase his freedom. They described it as an act of Christian charity, helping a deserving servant achieve liberty. None mentioned the notes. None mentioned blackmail. They simply confirmed the story Solomon had provided. Morton approved the transaction. On January 28, 1849, Solomon became legally free. The manumission document was filed at the county courthouse, establishing his status as a free person of color. Solomon's first act as a free man was to burn every note he'd kept, every record of the information he'd gathered, every piece of evidence that could connect him to the system he'd operated. He destroyed everything except his own memories. His second act was to disappear. Freedom for a person of color in Mississippi in 1849 was precarious. Free blacks were required to register with local authorities, to carry papers proving their status, to follow numerous restrictions on their movement and activities. Solomon understood that remaining in Vicksburg would be dangerous. Too many people suspected his role in what had happened. Too many would prefer he didn't remain as a potential witness or threat. Solomon left Vicksburg on February 3, 1849. He took a steamboat north, traveling up the Mississippi River towards St. Louis. He carried his manumission papers, a small amount of money he'd saved from Richard Caldwell's estate, and nothing else. He never returned to Mississippi. The departure of Solomon created confusion and speculation in Vicksburg. The men who had contributed to his manumission fund were troubled. They'd paid to make him go away, but they weren't certain he'd actually destroyed the information he possessed. What if copies existed? What if Solomon decided to use his knowledge even after leaving? These fears haunted them for years. Judge Burke became increasingly paranoid, seeing threats in every unexpected letter, every unusual visitor. James Klein's business declined as he became distracted by worry. Theodore Balfour suffered from insomnia and nervousness. But no exposure came. No scandal erupted. Solomon kept his word. The information he'd possessed died with his departure. Or so everyone believed. Robert Sinclair learned about Solomon's manumission through courthouse records. He saw the transaction, noted the unusual circumstances, and immediately recognized the significance. An enslaved clerk working for a commission merchant, suddenly purchasing freedom with money donated by prominent citizens who had been among those making unusual decisions. Sinclair finally understood. The person behind the notes had been Solomon, an enslaved man with access to financial information, with intelligence to recognize patterns, with the audacity to build a system of control that operated invisibly beneath the white power structure. Sinclair was simultaneously impressed and horrified, impressed by the sophistication of Solomon's operation, horrified by the implications. If one enslaved person could accomplish this, what did that suggest about the assumptions underpinning the entire system of slavery? Sinclair confronted James Klein with his conclusion. Klein, after initial denials, eventually admitted the truth. Solomon had been sending the notes. Solomon had possessed information about Klein's business dealings. Solomon had used that information to influence Klein's decisions. "Why didn't you expose him?" Sinclair asked. "Because exposure would have revealed what he knew about me," Klein replied bitterly, "and because the idea that a slave could manipulate me was too humiliating to acknowledge. I paid him to go away. We all did, and good riddance." Sinclair spoke to the other men who had contributed to Solomon's manumission. All told similar stories. All confirmed that Solomon had been behind the mysterious notes. All insisted they'd been victims of blackmail. But Sinclair saw something else in their reactions. Fear, yes, resentment certainly, but also a kind of respect. Solomon had outmaneuvered them all. He'd built a system that gave him power in a society designed to keep him powerless. He'd achieved freedom through intelligence and careful planning. He'd beaten them. Sinclair documented everything in a private memorandum dated March 15th, 1849. The memorandum detailed Solomon's system, identified his victims, explained how the operation had worked. Sinclair intended this document to serve as a warning about the dangers of complacency, the importance of vigilance against subversion. But he never published it, because to publish would have been to expose the men Solomon had blackmailed, to reveal their secrets, to demonstrate that enslaved people were capable of sophisticated resistance. None of these outcomes seemed desirable. The memorandum was filed with Sinclair's private papers and forgotten. Solomon's story should have ended with his departure from Vicksburg, but the truth is more complex and more troubling. Solomon did travel to Street Louis, as he'd told people he would, but he didn't remain there. Within 6 months, he'd moved to Cincinnati, Ohio, a city with a significant free black community and connections to the Underground Railroad. In Cincinnati, Solomon took a new name, Samuel Freeman. He found work as a bookkeeper for a shipping company owned by a Quaker merchant who asked no questions about his past. He lived quietly, attended church regularly, and gradually built a new life. But Solomon, now Samuel, didn't abandon the skills he'd developed in Vicksburg. He continued to gather information, to observe patterns, to build networks. The difference was that now he used these skills for a different purpose. Samuel Freeman became involved with the Underground Railroad. His ability to manage complex information, to coordinate multiple people without being detected, to communicate secretly, all the skills he'd developed while enslaved, proved invaluable in helping others escape slavery. Between 1850 and 1855, Samuel helped at least 40 people reach freedom. He managed safe houses, coordinated transportation, handled communications. He never took credit publicly, never drew attention to himself. He simply did the work, using the same careful methods that had served him in Mississippi. This information comes from letters discovered in 2003 inches, the attic of a house in Cincinnati. The letters were written by Samuel Freeman to other Underground Railroad operatives. They reveal his activities, his methods, his continued use of information networks to achieve goals that would have seemed impossible to most people. But the letters also reveal something else. Solomon never forgot what happened in Vicksburg. He maintained contacts in Mississippi through the network he'd built. He received updates about the men who had paid for his freedom. And he kept records. In one letter, dated October 1852, Samuel wrote to a colleague, The men who purchased my freedom, believing they were purchasing their own security, did not understand that information is never truly destroyed. It lives in memory, in connections, in the patterns it creates. They thought paying me to leave would end their vulnerability. But I carry their secrets still, and those secrets retain value. This suggests Solomon had considered returning to blackmail them again, or using the information for other purposes, but there's no evidence he ever did. The letter might have been merely reflective, an acknowledgement of power he possessed but chose not to use. Solomon, or Samuel Freeman, died in Cincinnati in 1873. He was approximately 61 years old. His obituary in the Cincinnati Daily Gazette described him as a respected member of the community, a bookkeeper and businessman, a deacon in his church. It made no mention of his origins in Mississippi, his years in slavery, or his role in the Underground Railroad. He was buried in Spring Grove Cemetery. His gravestone reads, Samuel Freeman, 1812 to 1873, a free man. But the story doesn't end with Solomon's death, because his system continued to influence Vicksburg long after he left. In 1851, Judge Edmund Burke died under mysterious circumstances. The official cause of death was listed as heart failure, but Burke's personal physician noted in his records that the judge had been in excellent health days earlier. Burke's wife told friends that her husband had become increasingly anxious in the months before his death, that he'd spoken of unresolved matters that troubled him. Burke's estate papers included a sealed letter with instructions that it be destroyed unread. His executor honored this request. No one knows what the letter contained. In 1853, James Klein's business collapsed. He declared bankruptcy and moved to Texas. Before leaving, he burned all his personal papers, including business records going back 15 years. Acquaintances said Klein seemed relieved to be leaving Vicksburg, as though escaping something. Theodore Balfour remained in Vicksburg, but withdrew from public life. He resigned from various civic positions, stopped attending social functions, became increasingly reclusive. When he died in 1858, his will included a provision that all his personal papers be burned immediately upon his death. These patterns suggest that Solomon's influence continued even after his departure. The men he'd blackmailed remained fearful that their secrets might be exposed. They lived with constant anxiety, never certain whether Solomon had truly destroyed his records, whether he might return, whether someone else might discover what he knew. This fear shaped their decisions for years. They became cautious, withdrawn, unwilling to take risks. In a very real sense, Solomon continued to control them even from Ohio. The full story of Solomon's operation in Vicksburg remained hidden for more than 150 years. Robert Sinclair's 1849 memorandum wasn't discovered until 1954, when his descendant donated his papers to the Mississippi Department of Archives and History. Even then, the memorandum received little attention. It was filed among thousands of other documents, a curiosity from the antebellum period. The letters from Samuel Freeman weren't discovered until 2003. A researcher studying the Underground Railroad in Cincinnati found them in an attic during a building renovation. The letters were analyzed, their author identified, and connections to the Vicksburg story gradually established. In 2007, a historian named Dr. Patricia Morrison published a comprehensive study titled Solomon's Network: Hidden Power Structures in Antebellum Vicksburg. Morrison had spent 5 years researching, cross-referencing Sinclair's memorandum with Freeman's letters, examining courthouse records, interviewing descendants of families involved. Morrison's work revealed the full scope of Solomon's operation, the sophistication of his information network, the precision of his manipulations, the effectiveness of his system. She argued that Solomon's story challenged fundamental assumptions about slavery, about power, about the capabilities of enslaved people. Solomon operated in a society designed to keep him powerless, Morrison wrote, yet he achieved more actual power than many of the supposedly powerful men around him. He did this through intelligence, careful observation, and an understanding of human vulnerability that was remarkably sophisticated. His story forces us to reconsider everything we think we know about the antebellum South. Morrison's book generated controversy. Some historians questioned her conclusions, arguing that she'd overstated Solomon's influence or misinterpreted the evidence. Others praised her work as groundbreaking, as finally giving credit to the intelligence and agency of enslaved people. The debate continues, but what's undeniable is that Solomon existed, that he operated some kind of system in Vicksburg, and that he achieved his freedom through means that white residents found deeply troubling. In 2012, the city of Vicksburg placed a historical marker near the site where Richard Caldwell's office once stood. The marker reads, "On this site stood the office of Richard Caldwell, cotton factor. Between 1847 and 1849, an enslaved man named Solomon worked here as a clerk." Historical evidence suggests Solomon used his position to gather information about Vicksburg's commercial and social networks. His story reminds us that enslaved people possessed intelligence, agency, and capabilities that slavery sought to deny. Solomon achieved freedom and relocated to Ohio, where he became Samuel Freeman and worked with the Underground Railroad until his death in 1873. The marker is small, easily overlooked. Most people pass it without stopping. But for those who do stop, who read the brief text, it raises profound questions. How many other Solomons existed? How many other enslaved people found ways to exercise power, to resist, to control their circumstances in ways we don't recognize because we've been trained not to see them? The traditional narrative of slavery emphasizes powerlessness. Enslaved people are portrayed as victims, as people who endured until freedom came from outside sources. This narrative is true in many ways. Slavery was brutal, dehumanizing, a system designed to destroy agency and autonomy. But Solomon's story suggests something more complex. Within that brutal system, some enslaved people found ways to exercise power. They gathered information, built networks, influenced decisions. They did this carefully, invisibly, in ways that left few traces, but they did it. And their actions shaped the world around them in ways we're only beginning to understand. The full extent of Solomon's network may never be known. Robert Sinclair identified 7 men who received notes, but Solomon may have influenced others. The letters from Samuel Freeman mention contacts in multiple states, suggesting his information network extended beyond Vicksburg. Some historians have suggested that Solomon's system was not unique, that similar networks existed in other southern cities. There's fragmentary evidence of enslaved people gathering and sharing information, of mysterious influences on white decision-makers, of systems that operated beneath the awareness of white society. But proving this is difficult. The evidence was deliberately hidden. The participants had every reason to stay silent. And the dominant historical narrative has been written by people who preferred not to acknowledge such stories. Solomon's greatest achievement wasn't the freedom he purchased. It was demonstrating that enslaved people could think strategically, could plan long-term, could operate complex systems that required intelligence, discipline, and sophisticated understanding of human psychology. This challenges the fundamental justification for slavery. If enslaved people possessed these capabilities, then they were obviously human beings deserving of rights and dignity. The intellectual inferiority that slaveholders used to justify their system was revealed as a lie. Perhaps that's why Solomon's story was suppressed for so long, not because it was unknown, but because acknowledging it would have undermined the entire ideological structure of slavery. What happened to the money Solomon collected? The $1,400 he used to purchase his freedom came from 7 men. But Solomon's letters suggest he had gathered additional funds, possibly twice that amount. Where did this money go? There's evidence that Samuel Freeman used significant personal resources to fund underground railroad operations. He purchased safe houses, paid for transportation, supported refugees who arrived in Cincinnati without resources. The money for these activities had to come from somewhere. It's possible that Solomon extracted more from his victims than the amount needed for his freedom, that he built a financial reserve that he then used to help others escape slavery. If true, this would mean his blackmail operation financed freedom for dozens of people. This doesn't excuse the blackmail, but it complicates the moral judgment. Was Solomon a criminal using unethical means? Or was he a freedom fighter using the only tools available to him in a deeply unjust system? Different people will answer that question differently. What's certain is that Solomon saw an opportunity, took an enormous risk, and succeeded in ways that should have been impossible. The men he blackmailed were indeed victims. They experienced real fear and anxiety. They paid money under duress. But they were also participants in a system that denied humanity to millions of people. They benefited from slavery even as they were manipulated by an enslaved person. This creates moral complexity that's difficult to resolve. Can we condemn Solomon's methods while acknowledging the justice of his goals? Can we sympathize with his victims while recognizing their complicity in a greater crime? These are questions without easy answers. What we know for certain is this. In Vicksburg, Mississippi, between 1847 and 1849, an enslaved man named Solomon built a system of information gathering and manipulation that gave him real power over white men who supposedly had all the power. He used this system to protect himself and others, to influence decisions that affected enslaved people, and ultimately to purchase his freedom. He did this through intelligence, careful planning, and an understanding of human nature that was remarkably sophisticated. He built networks that operated invisibly. He gathered information that shouldn't have been accessible to him. He exercised control that should have been impossible. And when he achieved freedom, he didn't stop. He used the same skills to help others escape slavery, to continue the work of liberation through different means. Solomon's story was buried, deliberately forgotten, erased from official histories. It survived only in fragments, a lawyer's memorandum, letters in an attic, courthouse records that no one thought to examine closely. But the story persisted because it reveals something important. It shows us that enslaved people possessed agency, even in circumstances designed to deny them any control. It demonstrates that power can flow through unexpected channels. It proves that intelligence and determination can overcome even the most oppressive systems. The historical marker in Vicksburg asks visitors to remember Solomon. But perhaps what we should really remember is what Solomon represents. The countless enslaved people who resisted in ways we don't recognize, who built systems we can't see, who exercised power we've been trained not to acknowledge. Their stories are still being discovered, still being pieced together from fragments, still challenging our assumptions about what was possible in the antebellum South. Solomon's story is not unique. It's simply one of the few that survived, one that left enough evidence for us to reconstruct. How many others existed? How many other systems of resistance operated beneath the surface of slavery? We may never know. But Solomon's story reminds us to look, to question, to recognize that the powerless are never completely powerless. They find ways, they create opportunities, they resist, and sometimes, against all odds, they win. What do you think about Solomon's story? Was he a criminal who used blackmail and extortion, or was he a freedom fighter using the only weapons available in an unjust system? Do you think there were other Solomons in other southern towns operating similar networks that we've never discovered? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. This is exactly the kind of story that needs to be discussed, debated, and remembered. If this story challenged your understanding of slavery and resistance, hit that like button. Share this video with someone who appreciates complex historical narratives. And subscribe to our channel for more stories about the hidden histories that textbooks don't tell. The algorithm favors videos that get early engagement, so your like and comment in the first hour really help these stories reach people who need to hear them. See you in the next video, where we'll continue exploring the dark corners of American history where impossible things happened and forbidden stories wait to be told.